From the KPFK studios in Southern California,
it's the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with Ralph. Hello, Ralph. How are you doing today?
Good, Steve. We got a great program today.
We do. On the show today, we are going to be talking to John R. MacArthur, the president of Harper's Magazine and an expert on so-called free trade deals. A lot of that stuff is coming up in the next few weeks. He's going to give us an update on the battle in Congress over the Trans-Pacific Partnership. But first, we're going to talk about real war, the kind with bullets and bombs. And our first guest, well, let me say this first. We live in a country now where we seem to be in a state of perpetual war that is conducted by an all-volunteer army, meaning most of us don't have to bear any of the burdens. And it seems that the hawkish among our politicians are the ones who have never seen war, the most hawkish, which brings us to our first guest. Barry Ladendorf is the president of an organization called Veterans for Peace, which is a global network of military veterans and allies who work to build a culture of peace by using their experiences to educate the public about the enormous costs of war. They advocate for dismantling the war economy, and they provide services that assist veterans and victims of war. We are honored to welcome to the show the president of Veterans for Peace, Barry Ladendorf. Welcome, Mr. Ladendorf.
Hey, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And I'm very happy to have you here, Mr. Ladendorf. I'm going to call you Barry because we've known each other for a while. I'm a member of the Veterans for Peace. We had a meeting in Washington a few days ago with Veterans for Peace members. And what is most impressive to our listeners, I think, is a group of veterans going back to World War II and all the way since then that are the most vigorous and comprehensive advocates of peace, which we're going to talk about today. Waging peace takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of stamina. And Barry is an exponent of that battle for peace. So I'm going to ask you right off, briefly discuss the goals of Veterans for Peace. If Congress listened to you and the White House listened to you, what would happen?
Thank you very much, Ralph. And let me begin by thanking you for being a member of Veterans for Peace, but also for agreeing to be on our advisory board. And I'm very proud of the members of our advisory board, including yourself and many other prominent Americans and ex-veterans who have supported the work and the effort of Veterans for Peace. So thank you for your continued support to our efforts.
You're welcome.
What would be our goals as Veterans for Peace if Congress and the President would listen to us? Well, ultimately, the goal of Veterans for Peace is to abolish war as an instrument of national policy. If we could get them to listen to some of the ideas that we have about how we could go about that, I think we could be successful. I think one of the things that has to be understood is that we have to create the notion that ending war is really possible. I think most of the public, most members of Congress, probably most people everywhere think that war is inevitable. And I think we have to create a different paradigm, a different mindset that we can actually end war.
Don't we belong to a treaty back to the 1920s, abolished war?
We do.
What's the name of it?
Absolutely, the Kellogg-Briand Treaty. In fact, that treaty outlawed war. There's a very great book by another one of our advisory board members, David Swanson, called The Year That We Ended War. And that war, when Frank Kellogg, who was the Secretary of State at the time, accepted the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in that. And in 1931, when he went to Oslo, Norway to accept the Peace Prize, he announced to the people during his acceptance speech that we had outlawed war. Now, interestingly enough, while the Congress passed the Kellogg-Briand Pact to ratify the treaty, which becomes, as you know, part of the Constitution of the United States because it is a treaty, the Congress also funded armaments for rebuilding the U.S. Navy at the same time that they were ending war. But, you know, that treaty has been ignored. I think there was one incident when Russia was involved with the Japanese and the world nations called on them as a signatory nation that they had an obligation not to do that, and they did pull back. That's the only incident that I am aware of. although it was used a young Marine officer who was able to get the attention through a friend or a son of Franklin Roosevelt to get him to consider the aspects of the treaty as part of the Nuremberg war crimes. And that became part of the idea of aggressive war being a war crime. And it came from the notion expressed in the Kellogg-Briand Treaty. But you're correct. Every time we go to war, every time we do, we are in violation of international law. And of course, there's a long history of that, particularly if you look at the history of the United States after World War II.
Yeah, I wanted our listeners to be reminded of that, because wars of aggression are in violation of international law. But another one of your goals on your statement of purpose, and listeners can get this statement of purpose, which is really remarkably concise and forward-looking, by going to the Veterans for Peace website, and it's veteransforpeace.org. Very simple, veteransforpeace.org. And one of the purposes is to increase public awareness of the costs of war. And you have a rather dramatic way of doing it when you send letters out to your members. You want to describe that briefly, and we'll go to the other goals too?
Right, sure. Well, to increase the public awareness of the cost of war, one of the things that most people will focus on is, the cost of war is the loss of life. American servicemen and women who die or injured as a result of war, the cost to the people of the United States for the cost of war. We don't always consider the cost to the nations that we invade, bomb, and so forth, the refugees that we create. We don't often consider, and what Veterans for Peace is doing more and more, is to try to broaden the scope of the cost of war, to include environmental damage. When you look at the tremendous costs of preparation for war and the conducting of war itself, the damage to the environment is monumental. When you think about the impact of the testing of nuclear weapons in the Marshall Islands between 1946 and 1967, I believe it was, where we conducted 67 nuclear tests at that time. And the largest occurred on March 1st, 1954, Castle Bravo, which was a 15-megaton bomb that was 1,000 times larger and more powerful than the bombs we dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So when we talk about the cost of war, we talk about the environmental damage, and there's more to say about that if you want to get into that later. Another aspect of cost of war is our civil rights and civil liberties that people don't often think about. But if you look at going back even to the First World War, and how the Department of Justice had a group of some 200,000 people that they basically deputized to watch other Americans. And because their claim was that we only had a few hundred agents and we couldn't do all the work that needed to be done, so we had these deputized people going about spying on other Americans on behalf of the Department of Justice. And so we look at the national security state that we have today. Well, we know what Snowden has revealed about what the government is doing, listening in on our phone conversations and all of that. So those costs of war began to mount up. And I think that what the American people have to realize is that these endless illegal wars are a tragedy that we continue to pay for. And if you think of this as a factor in itself, and just the cost of war, if you think about since 2001, the United States is spending $8.36 million an hour for the cost of war since 2001. And
say that again, Barry. Say that again.
Yes. Every hour, taxpayers in the United States are spending $8.36 million for the total cost of our war since 2001. And if you think about this, just take out the part about ISIS. What we are spending every hour just for the actions against ISIS in the Middle East is costing taxpayers of the United States $615,482 an hour to fight these wars. And think of how that money could be better spent. When the government tells us, we don't have money for education, we can't fund health care, we can't rebuild our cities, we can't fix the infrastructure that is falling down, we can't fix the thousands of bridges in this country that are in this state of collapse. Think about that. And you think about, if I could just give you an example of California where I live. Around 2012, California had a budget deficit of $25 billion. At that same time, the cost of the taxpayers of California, the proportionate share that taxpayers in California had contributed to the cost of war since 2001 was $160 billion just for the cost of war. That's not the defense budget. That's the cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. That was the burden that the taxpayers in California were sharing or carrying. And meanwhile, we have a $25 billion deficit where we have to cut school spending, health care, relief for those in need. So
all these figures, Barry, should be part of the discussion in the presidential and congressional campaigns coming up. And listeners, you should insist on this. You get very good material on this by going to veteransforpeace.org. Listeners should know that Barry was a commissioned ensign in the U.S. Navy in the mid-'60s. He was in the Pacific Fleet. He was working in the area of intelligence and foreign training. He was also Deputy Attorney General of the California Department of Justice, graduate University San Diego School of Law. He has a big background to substantiate what he's been saying. Another goal I see of Veterans for Peace is to, quote, to restrain our government from intervening overtly and covertly in the internal affairs of other nations. How about that one?
Yeah, well, that's really, when you think about it, it started back in the 1950s, didn't it, when we had the CIA. And, President Eisenhower made quite a point that he was not interested in any kind of overt wars. But the Dulles brothers managed to convince the Eisenhower administration that the use of the CIA in covert operations to overthrow governments was an acceptable foreign policy for the United States. And so along with the British, particularly when British Petroleum was concerned about the potential loss of oil leases in Iran and Iraq when they were going to nationalize those. By the way, after democratic elections in which the people elected through the democratic process leaders that they wanted to have, and you look at Guatemala, where the president of Guatemala was a democratically elected governor, but the United Fruit Company, because some of the land was going to be taken and given to peasants who had no means of providing a living for themselves, the people in Guatemala, through the elected representative, the president, decided that it was their land and they needed to use it for the purposes of helping those people. But of course, the United Fruit Company was upset by that, as British Petroleum and other oil companies were in the Mideast. And so it launched these covert efforts to overthrow the governments, and that's what we did. We overthrew democratically elected governments in Guatemala. We did the same in Iraq. We did the same in Iran. And so this sort of process has gone on, and so we're paying the consequences of that. I think it's pretty clear when you look at what's happening across the globe in the Middle East. Our policies there, we put into place the Shah of Iran, for example, which he killed then thousands of people and imprisoned thousands of others. And so when you look at it, is it any wonder that, as William Blum points out in his book, Democracy, America's Most Dangerous Export, that since the end of World War II, we have attempted to assassinate or overthrow over 50 different governments. We've bombed 30 countries. We have made millions of refugees in countries throughout the world. We've killed millions of people. And when you think about that, is there any wonder that we had the blowback that we had in 2001 with the unfortunate 9/11 incident? I mean, very unfortunate, but if you read Chalmers Johnson's book, Blowback, which he published in 1999, and by the way, he is a member of Veterans for Peace as well, he wrote the book, and you could, if you read that book, you can almost predict that 9/11 would happen. And I recommend to your listeners that that's a fascinating book to get an understanding of United States foreign policy leading during that period of time and unfortunately continuing today.
A lot of listeners may not know that Veterans for Peace is a widespread advocate of nonviolent civil disobedience. I mean, you've been on the ramparts. Veterans for Peace have been arrested. They go to the national political conventions. So they're very, very serious in what they do. And it's such a refreshing contrast with the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars conventions and their political positions. How do you relate to them? Can you give us some brief comments on why these veterans organizations, which have huge membership, always seem to be portraying very militant and aggressive postures toward the rest of the world that have very little with self-defense of our country? What's going on here? And how do they react to Veterans for Peace?
Well, I can tell you that, what's interesting, Ralph, is that if you look, we were talking and you brought up the Kellogg-Briand Treaty back in the 20s. And what's interesting, if you look at the history, the American Legion, believe it or not, was a strong advocate of that treaty. Now, what happened after the 1920s, because there was in the 1920s a tremendous peace movement throughout the world because of World War I, and the American Legion got behind this treaty. What happened to them since, I really don't know. And I'm not a member of those organizations, so it's difficult for me to speak to their policies.
Have they ever reacted to what you do? Have they criticized you?
You know what? I have not seen that. I have seen members of those. I remember once when we were marching in the Martin Luther King parade here in San Diego in January. We marched in that parade, and one of the alarming things about this parade, Ralph, I'll just tell you about, is that up until this year, the police and the FBI and those agencies would march in the parade, and of course they'd always carried one of their armored vehicles through the streets of southeast San Diego where the people live. We've always thought that in Veterans for Peace as a reminder that, yes, we're here to honor Veterans for Peace, but don't get too excited or don't get too uppity because we have these kinds of weapons to keep people in place. And one of our members actually confronted them and stood in front of their vehicle and berated them. He was a retired lieutenant colonel in the Air Force, whose father, by the way, was killed in Vietnam as an Air Force pilot. And he stood in front of their vehicle and berated them for what they were doing. And we did have some members of the veterans standing alongside that had their Foreign Legion hats on, or American Legion caps. And as we came by, a few of them turned their backs on us and refused to look at us. Now, one thing I've noticed, too, is that those organizations are losing members, and they're having a very difficult time of gaining new members, whereas what we're finding out is that we are attracting young members to Veterans for Peace, young veterans of the Iraq War, young veterans of Afghanistan, and they are coming to our conventions because, as a recent article pointed out, what these young people are looking for is to try to give back to the community. They're trying to become active and engaged in what's going on. Because of their experience in war, they have seen the impact of it, and they want to come back and they want to mend themselves from the ravages of war. And one of the ways that they're finding out they can do that is through community service and being involved in Veterans for Peace. And so while we're growing, the other veterans organizations are not growing.
Barry, have you ever asked to speak at the VFW National Convention or American Legion?
I have not done that, but I have spoken to we have a Veterans Council here in San Diego that's made up of about, 190 organizations of various veterans group. And we, in Veterans for Peace, a few years ago, probably 4 or 5 years ago, decided to join that. And when we made our first appearance there wearing our Veterans for Peace shirts, we were sort of looked at as sort of oddballs, and we didn't have a feeling of being very welcomed. But because of some of the things that we did in the community, we have part of the Veterans for Peace goals that we'll probably want to talk about is to seek justice for veterans and victims of war. So one of those kind of campaigns that we have done locally is that in 2011, we found that there were a host of veterans sleeping on the streets of San Diego without any means of shelter. And one of our veterans talked to them and said, gee, how can we help you? You know what their answer was? If you could just get me a sleeping bag. And so what we did is we decided that what we might do is to launch a campaign here in San Diego to raise money. And we had a very modest goal. We said if we could maybe get 100 sleeping bags, and we could raise $3,000 to do that we worked a deal with one of the local supplying stores here that they gave us a deal and gave it to us for wholesale. What we have done since 2011, Ralph, is that we've raised over $60,000. We've delivered over 2,500 sleeping bags and rain ponchos to homeless veterans living on the streets of San Diego. And we don't if they're not a veteran, we do not refuse to give them a bag also. Because what we look at is not only are the veterans on the street the victims of war, but many of the people living on the streets are the victims of our endless wars because we don't have the money to take care of them. They have lost their jobs. They don't have medical care. They can't educate their children. We found families living on the street who can't pay their rent. But we have tried to do that. And when I've gone to the Veterans Council and gave a talk to all the veterans groups about what we're doing and how we could need their help and assistance, and they gave us a standing ovation, and their chapters offered to pitch in and provide some money to help our goals.
Listening to you, Barry, reminds me that back many years ago during the Vietnam War, we had a task force. We put out a book called Discarded Army. In other words, what happens to Vietnam veterans when they came back, and it was pretty awful. A lot of people know that story now, and we seem to be repeating this situation with coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq and other military theaters, as they call it. We've been talking with Barry Ladendorf, who's the president of Veterans for Peace. The headquarters are in St. Louis, Missouri. Barry, tell people how to join Veterans for Peace. You have to be a veteran, first of all, to join, and how would they go about joining?
Well, first of all, you don't have to be a veteran. I think 20% of our members are associate members. The majority of us are veterans, of course. Here's one way to do it is go to the website that you mentioned, Ralph. That is veteransforpeace.org, O-R-G. And you can just check out the website. There's applications there. It'll give you a list of chapters. We have around 160 chapters throughout the United States. We have a chapter in United Kingdom, which was one of our most active chapters anywhere. They have over 150 members, and they've now spread out from London to other major cities in the United Kingdom. We just launched a chapter, approved a chapter for Ireland. We have Veterans for Peace in Dublin now. We have a Veterans for Peace organization in South Korea, in Vietnam. And we have members in various parts of the world that are trying to start chapters, one in Germany, Australia. And what we'd like to see, Ralph, in the long term is that if we could circle the planet with veterans and organized to oppose war, to stand up against their government's endless wars, to seek an end to nuclear weapons, and to eliminate the arms race, we think we can have a powerful voice in the world community and end this kind of senseless, endless wars. And we think that we can do that. It's a lot of effort, but we welcome anybody to join Veterans for Peace.
What's the minimum dues to become a member? And they get a wonderful newsletter, a terrific newsletter, full of facts and courage, moral courage, as well as facts.
Right. Well, we've just, we also, the dues, is $40 a year. Pretty modest sum. Most people can afford that. And we have a number of lifetime members. Those people who are able to do that pay $1,000, and you're a lifetime member. You don't have to worry about dues the rest of your career with Veterans for Peace. So that's we encourage that, of course. But $40, and what we do in our chapters, and most chapters will do this. If you have people that want to join Veterans for Peace and can't afford it, then the chapters will usually just fund it for you, or we'll work with people and waive their dues if they can't, if they're economic hardship. And we have a new program for
tell them about the new program. Go ahead.
Right. These are post 9/11 veterans for $10 a year for the first 3 years of their membership. So that's $30 for 3 years. We will also waive the registration fee at our national conventions, which is normally $200 fee. So that gets waived. Plus, we have a very active program we started last year through money that we fund at the national level, plus from donations from our members to supplement that, is to help these young veterans travel to the convention if they can not afford it on their own. And so many of those veterans are in school. They're trying to get a job. They're trying to get back on their feet. They want to come to the conventions, and the camaraderie and the relationships and the sense of solidarity that these people experience. And I can tell you that as a veteran, I experience at every convention that I attend. It's something that you can't, I guess as a veteran, you understand that. It may be difficult for others to do that, but there's a sense of solidarity and camaraderie and purpose that we have when we come together as a group. As Doug Rawlings was saying this past weekend, Doug, Ralph, when we were at the Vietnam Memorial during Full Disclosure campaign, Doug said, it's so good to be around veterans and to have a meeting of the tribe, as he called it. And I agreed with that. That solidarity is something that's important.
Barry, now that we're at it, I attest to that. I was at one of your conventions in Boston, and it's really a great spirit. Where is the upcoming convention this summer? Can you tell our listeners?
Sure. This convention this summer is going to be in San Diego, California. And I think we're going to have a marvelous convention. We've got some tremendous workshops. We've got some tremendous speakers lined up. The keynote speaker at the convention this year is going to be Seymour Hersh. He's going to be the banquet speaker. One thing that's going to happen that is going to be very unique, and that is that the restoration of the first peace boat, the Golden Rule, which is going to be launched at the shipyard on Samoa Island up in Eureka, California, will be launched June 20th. And that first peace boat, which has a remarkable history, will sail from there to enter the San Diego harbor, flying the Veterans for Peace flag, and join us here at the convention. And if I could just add to that, Ralph, that boat, then its purpose will be, at least in the first year or so, will be to sail to various ports in the West Coast, and it will be an educational platform for Veterans for Peace to wage peace against the U.S. militarism, to call for an end to nuclear weapons, to end the arms race, and it will be also a testament to the importance of the environment and the ocean environment. We will go into port and talk to people in those communities, have school kids come and hear about the history of this famous Golden Rule.
That Golden Rule peace boat many years ago actually inspired Greenpeace to have their own boats.
It did. It was an inspiration to Greenpeace. And it's a remarkable story. Not only that, but the history of that boat, even though the boat did not make it from Honolulu to its intended location in 1958, which was to disrupt the series of nuclear tests that were going on in the Marshall Islands at the time, they were stopped by the Coast Guard. They were taken into federal court on a drummed-up regulation that the Atomic Energy Commission passed without any hearings, mostly against this boat. And when these people were charged, criminal conspiracy and so forth, the regulation was ultimately withdrawn. But that protest by that boat and that crew launched a worldwide campaign where there was so much attention worldwide. And I was surprised in reading this book about the editorials from the New York Times to the Boston Herald to the Honolulu Advertiser across the country. There were editorial comments about the courageous crew of this little 30-foot sailboat that was going to sail into and disrupt nuclear testing. And because of the support around the world and the launched really the campaign against nuclear testing, in 1963, of course, the Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed by the Soviet Union, the United States, and the United Kingdom. And many people believe that the start of that campaign, well, it started earlier, but it gave a new impetus to that campaign, was the courageous act by the crew of the Golden Rule.
A little-known story, and I'm glad you're bringing it to a broader visibility in the coming months. The Veterans for Peace, by the way, are a very innovative organization. Just briefly, before we close, I want you to describe Smedley Butler's work, too, in closing. But before we close, tell our listeners about the Morning Tower that was exhibited in Washington, D.C. a few days ago. That's Mourning.
The tower was built by a member of Veterans for Peace in Asheville, North Carolina, which was the scene of our convention last year. And that tower, can't remember how tall it is, but it stood in the downtown area of Asheville during the convention, and many people saw that, and it became a real symbol of what we were doing at the convention. And it was decided that when we would have the full disclosure event in Washington, D.C., this gentleman decided to load it up and bring it to Washington, D.C., and erected it there on the mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial, not far from the Vietnam Memorial. And we're hoping that we'll be able to bring that tower to San Diego at the convention there.
Barry, just in closing, tell our listeners who may not be aware of who Marine General Smedley Butler was and what little book he wrote that we all should read.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. Smedley Butler is a phenomenal person. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, rose to the rank of Major General. I think he retired around 1937, but he wrote a book called War is a Racket. And what he said in the book, it's more of a pamphlet than a real long book, but he said in the book is that he had been basically duped and that he was nothing more than a hired henchman or a hired gun for American corporate interest. He said, I made it possible for Standard Oil to be involved in China. I made the bankers able to exploit the people in Central America and elsewhere in the world. Everywhere the United States went, he said it was the corporate interest that the United States was protecting. And he said, that was what I did. His book was a total rejection of his military career.
He received the Congressional Medal of Honor twice.
Oh, he did. Twice, right. He was twice decorated with the Congressional Medal of Honor. And what's interesting is that there was a book about this so-called some business interest trying to interest Smedley Butler in a coup to overthrow the Roosevelt administration. And, of course, Butler would have no part of it, and I think turned the folks in, and stop was put to that. But Butler is a really great hero. Most Marines don't even know about this. You talk to them about Marines that ask if they heard of Smedley Butler, and they say, oh, yeah, he's a great hero.
They know it. They're taught about his military military tactics, but not the book War is a Racket, Marines have told me. War is a Racket is still in print. As Barry said, it's a very short little book, but what a powerful message. Just in conclusion, Barry, let me just ask you a few very simple questions about where you have been interviewed. Have you ever been interviewed by Charlie Rose?
No.
Have you ever been interviewed by Terry Gross?
No.
Have you ever been interviewed by the Diane Rehm Show?
No.
These are nationally syndicated shows. Charlie Rose is television. The other two are radio. Have you ever been interviewed by On Point Tom Ashbrook out of Boston? That's NPR Radio.
No.
Well, you see, Steve, the point here again and again, that even the more serious media is trivializing itself. They have endless people being interviewed for their psychological forays for something they may have written in terms of a pulp novel or a Hollywood show. But people who are significantly bringing to the American public the most awesome, the most serious questions before us are not ever on the show. So I think listeners can help on this by just phoning NPR and phoning PBS or emailing them or writing a letter and saying, what's going on here? I want to thank you, Barry, for your work and those of your associates, and I hope your convention in San Diego is a great success. Give the date of that and how people can get more information on your website.
Sure. The convention will be in San Diego at the Town & Country Resort Hotel from August the 5th until August the 9th. And this is the 30th anniversary year of Veterans for Peace, so we will be celebrating 30 years of our existence, fighting against war, seeking the abolition of war, the ending of nuclear weapons, exposing the true cost of war. We'll be celebrating that. We will also be discussing the tragedy of 70 years since the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the 50 years since the start of the Vietnam War, and the 40 years since the end of that war. So those will all be areas of concentration that we want to make the public aware of during our convention. And I think we're going to have a great convention. I hope people will consider joining us there. Now, as to membership, again, I would say veteransforpeace.org. And by the way, if I could just add this, if you go to the website today, there is a remarkable article written by a young veteran, a new member of Veterans for Peace, who is an Afghan veteran, and he is writing a very powerful statement about why he is a member of Veterans for Peace. And anybody who has a son or a daughter who is interested in the military, or any person who wants to inform themselves about what we're doing in those two wars, ought to read this young man's statement about what's happening and why he joined Veterans for Peace to join the struggle against these endless, senseless, illegal, unjustified, unconstitutional, unnecessary wars.
So well said. Thank you very much, Barry Ladendorf, for sharing some time on our program. And I'm sure the listeners will respond accordingly to their interest in not just opposing these wars of aggression and their costs to our country and to countries and people around the world, but to actively wage peace. That's why the Veterans for Peace is called Veterans for Peace, not Veterans Against War. There's a real affirmative motive behind the many, many members of Veterans for Peace. Thank you very much, Barry Ladendorf.
Thank you, Ralph. I really appreciate it, and thank you for your service to Veterans for Peace.
We've been talking to Barry Ladendorf, president of Veterans for Peace. For more information, go to veteransforpeace.org. You are listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. We will take a short break and come right back with John R. MacArthur of Harper's Magazine, who's going to give us the latest on the battle over the trade deal known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Back after this.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan here with Ralph. And before we get to our next guest, I want to remind everyone that Ralph's latest book, Return to Sender, Unanswered Letters to the President, 2003-2014, from Seven Stories Press, is available in fine bookstores everywhere. And we did an entire episode where we discussed the book a few weeks back. So if you missed that, go to iTunes, Stitcher, RalphNaderRadioHour.com, Nader.org, or Ralph's Facebook page. They're all posted there. And that archive episode will give you a little taste of how Ralph challenged Presidents Bush and Obama on a whole raft of issues. And I'm going to embarrass Ralph again here by saying in his review of the book, Chris Hedges writes, quote, that he refuses to surrender and doggedly struggles against all odds for American democracy and rule of law makes Nader one of the moral and intellectual giants of our age, which begs the question is, what am I doing on this show? So pick up a copy of Return to Sender at fine bookstores everywhere. Now we're going to move on to our next guest. And I just want to say over much of the past year, a significant block of Congress and a whole lot of citizens groups have been fighting with the White House over the fast-tracking of an Asian trade deal known as the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP for short. Now, this trade deal appears to be modeled on the now infamous NAFTA trade deal of the early 90s. And I say appears to be modeled because a lot of secrecy surrounds this deal. Regular listeners of the show might remember the conversation we had with Lori Wallach of Public Citizens Global Trade Watch a few months back. And Lori, who has been out front on this issue since the beginning, gave us a lot of background and pointed out that these trade deals, they really amount to very little with trade. They are essentially a backdoor way for multinational corporations to bypass a lot of our health, safety, and environmental laws and feature very secretive investor-state dispute settlement tribunals, which brings us to our next guest. Our next guest has also been covering this since the beginning, and he's here to give us an update on this ongoing battle. He's the president of Harper's Magazine. He has a regular column in the Providence Journal and is the author of The Selling of Free Trade, NAFTA, Washington, and the Subversion of American Democracy. His name is John R. MacArthur. Thanks for joining us, Mr. MacArthur.
Thanks for having me.
Rick, you also never surrender and are a consistent voice for democratic values. In your book, you went into some detail that when the vote in Congress on NAFTA was close and they had to go for getting 20 wavering members of the House, for example, they played some pretty hard politics of carrot and stick. And you're already seeing that happen with great intensity on the Trans-Pacific Agreement, which is subject to a big battle in the House on whether it can be fast-tracked through the Congress without any amendments and very abbreviated debate time. Can you describe what happened under NAFTA and what you see happening to TPP?
Well, there's two distinct campaigns. The first one is Fast Track, which is what we're going through right now. And in that instance, in 1991, you had Democratic majorities in both houses who were being pressed and bribed and coerced by President Bush, the elder. You had a Republican president, two Democratic majorities in both houses. The problem there was you had naive, or you can say cynical, leadership in the House in the form of Richard Gephardt, who was running for president, and persuaded himself that if he could get Bush to agree in principle to putting labor rights and environmental protection on the table before Fast Track was authorized, he would score a major victory. He would change the whole nature of trade debates in the future. And he was catastrophically wrong. And he admits it. He admits it in my book. I interviewed him in detail. He really believed, or he says he believed, that he could manipulate the debate in favor of labor and environmental issues. The problem is, of course, that the whole reason to move your factory to China, to Mexico, to Vietnam, to Malaysia, because now TPP is really focused on moving a production to Malaysia and Vietnam because they're even cheaper than China. The whole advantage to doing the business there is that there's no environmental regulation and you can pay workers next to nothing. So to put these things on the table, to try to coerce foreign governments into respecting what in effect is American labor and environmental law runs completely contrary to the purpose of these deals, which is to protect American investments in these countries, make it easier to set up shop. So Gephardt gave away the store before, and I'm worried that Nancy Pelosi, as minority leader, because in this case, the Democrats have less leverage than they had in 1991, that Pelosi's going to give away the store in the same way.
Rick MacArthur, give us some examples on how votes were procured that were wavering in the NAFTA period in the House of Representatives.
Okay, so once Gephardt gave away the store and fast track was passed, and then eventually the Clinton administration negotiated the deal in secret, when it came out, we had the same coalition of opposition to the NAFTA deal that we have opposing fast track and TPP today, AFL-CIO, to some extent environmental groups, although they caved in eventually to Clinton. And what they did to buy votes to get the wavering Democrats was very crude. They bought the Florida delegation, several votes in the Florida delegation, simply by guaranteeing that the school lunch program would buy more tomatoes. They bought Esteban Torres's vote, congressman from California, a former auto worker, UAW official, by creating something called the National Development Bank, which was supposed to build better infrastructure along the border between Mexico and the United States to help the environment, to help Mexico. Almost none of it happened. Almost none of the money got spent. Torres was completely conned. Some of them went cheaper, like Bill Brewster from Oklahoma, simply had to be promised a photo op with Clinton where they went hunting together. They went duck hunting together. This is the kind of thing that the Clinton administration did brilliantly or sleazily, depending on your point of view, that I'm not entirely sure Obama's is good at. But you can be sure that some people working for Obama are working the same sorts of, or making the same sorts of offers.
He's already bringing some of these Democrats to the White House. He's got corporate lobbyists schmoozing them. But right now, my latest count is that together with the Tea Party opponents in the Republican Party in the House and most of the Democrats, with the exception of maybe 20, are opposing the Trans-Pacific Agreement, that Speaker Boehner does not have the votes to put fast track on the floor of the House as of now. So, folks, keep up the heat. It's tradewatch.org to get more information. And in conclusion, Rick MacArthur, a publisher of Harper's Magazine, a brief comment on how the media is playing the TPP.
The media is playing it completely wrong. I mean, for one thing, they're giving the conservatives, quote unquote, a pass. They're allowing people to say a true conservative supports free trade. First of all, these are not free trade agreements. They're about investments and moving jobs overseas to cheaper labor locales. But lots of right-wingers, conservatives, like the late Roger Millikan, oppose free trade. And the Times, particularly the New York Times, just gives them all a pass and says, oh yeah, being a right-winger goes hand in hand with being for free trade. This is nonsense. It's simply not true in American history. And the old Republican Party was very much for high tariffs, the Lincoln Republican Party. The real problem is with the Democrats, with the liberal Democrats, and that's who Obama is putting the most pressure on. And my greatest fear is that Nancy Pelosi will cave in, and she'll come out and say, well, I've agreed to vote for this on the condition that I've been promised that the deal will address currency manipulation, labor rights in Malaysia and Vietnam, and environmental protection. I have confidence in the president. And then, of course, the horse is out of the barn and it's over, because by the time the thing gets negotiated, it'll be too late to put these things in. And then the real vote buying will start.
And then President Obama keeps saying, well, environment, labor, consumer protections are all in there, but they're completely unenforceable. It's just rhetoric, as you alluded. Steve, in closing, do you have a question for Rick MacArthur, and do you subscribe to Harper's?
Actually, I did read the latest issue of Harper's. I read the issue about what's wrong with Obama by David Bromwich, which brings me to my next question. What is wrong with Obama on this issue? I know we talked to Lori Wallach about this, and it's a bit of a mystery to her, but is he in some sort of Svengali hold by his advisors? He should get this. How come he doesn't get this? What is wrong with Obama?
Well, Obama is a very conventionally minded politician to begin with, but he is in this Svengali-like hold of the Chicago machine, the Chicago Democratic machine. And please don't forget, anyone, that this is his power base. And the Chicago machine, I'm talking about Richard and Bill Daley, the brothers, and Rahm Emanuel, the current mayor of Chicago, who were absolutely critical in the passage of NAFTA. Without them, NAFTA would not exist. And Obama owes his political career to the Dalys. He's not about to cross them. And moreover, he's thinking now about his legacy, quote unquote, or his career after he's in the White House. And the last thing most graduates of Harvard Law School, and I guess maybe even Columbia College, my alma mater, want said about them is that they lined up with radical elements, left-wing elements who opposed free trade. Free trade, it's like something from the Bible for these people. They are absolutely devoted to the idea. It's next to godliness. And it's also very good for corporate America. So if you want to keep friendly ties with corporations after you leave the White House, like Bill Clinton, you don't get on the wrong side of this issue. But the dailies, again, are crucial in this equation. Good journalists, good reporters would be following Bill Daley around on Capitol Hill, seeing what he's doing right now. I don't know if he's involved directly in the lobbying for TPP, but he was critical in the passage of NAFTA and permanent normal trade relations with China in 2000.
No, Bill Daley's he's at it again. He had an op-ed recently in favor of the Trans-Pacific Agreement.
Ralph, let's remember Daley was Barack Obama's chief of staff for a year. So he's very close to Obama, very close to him.
That's right. Well, thank you very much, Rick MacArthur, publisher of Harper's Magazine. And if you want to learn why we don't call it free trade, we call it corporate managed trade, go for the facts on tradewatch.org and see what you can do with their suggestions that are very concrete back where you live and work to put the pressure on members of Congress to defend our economic, political, environmental, and consumer interests here at home and not cede into some autocratic transnational system of secret government. And these tribunals are literally secret. Thank you very much, Rick.
Thanks for having me, Ralph.
I want to thank John R. MacArthur of Harper's Magazine and the author of The Selling of Free Trade, NAFTA, Washington, and the Subversion of American Democracy. We'll be back with more of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour after this.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
From Pacifica, you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Stand up. Oh, step up.
Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan along with Ralph. Remember to subscribe to us on iTunes as a podcast. If you've missed any of this episode, you can go back to the archives and get that or any other episodes we have at ralphnaderradiohour.com or iTunes, Stitcher, wherever fine podcasts are sold or given away for free for that matter. I want to switch gears here now. Ralph, you want to talk about something that was in the New York Times recently. In recent years, there's been a lot of controversy over various laws in certain states that make it harder for people to vote. In Maryland, one particular population has been banned from voting altogether. Who are these people, Ralph?
These are ex-felons who have served their time, and there are a whole raft of state laws that punish ex-felons who have served their time and are trying to integrate back into society. They prevent them from voting. They have them presented with huge obstacles if they want to get public benefits, if they want to get housing, if they want to get employment. And in a future program, I'm going to go into this in considerable detail because it troubles me that after people have served their time, and they come out and they're punished without any due process of law, without able to confront the punishers by a raft of state laws. And I think there's a lot going on in this area, led by the Vera Institute of Justice in New York, and we're going to go into it in some depth. But I just wanted to alert listeners to that topic. When you have 5 million plus people who are prohibited from voting in a number of states, not all states, because they were ex-felons, that to me raises serious constitutional and civil rights issues.
All right, I look forward to that. Now we have time left on the show to get some of your Facebook questions. And the first one comes from Terrence Flanagan. And Terrence asks, why isn't desalinization used more frequently?
One reason is it's extremely expensive to set up these plants on the coasts of oceans, and it is being done. There's going to be some built in California because of the drought problem, and some other countries have experienced similar technological applications, but the main problem is the cost.
And what about the environmental argument against it? Isn't that another assault, if you excuse the expression, assault on the ocean by taking ocean water for our own use?
There are other consequences to it, but by comparison with fresh water, properly filtered, such as activated carbon, it's extremely expensive per gallon. It's only desperate societies that have to resort to it.
I just heard a report here in California. People were able to reduce their water use by 13%, which was 12% short of the goal, but still significant. And it always amazes me when we are called on to conserve, people respond for the most part. They're able to do it. Our next question comes from Laura Palmer. Why do you no longer participate with and help build the Green Party? Do you still consider yourself a member? Would you consider running for the Green nomination again? Let's take the first part first. Why do you no longer participate with and help the Green Party?
Well, I always say good things about the Green Party as I go around the country. I'm not a member of the Green Party, never was. I ran as a non-member on the Green Party nomination in 1996 and 2000. I would not consider running for the Green nomination again. I don't think I'll be a candidate for president again. But my advice to the Green Party is to dramatically increase the number of people who are running on the Green ticket at the local level for city council, board of education, you name it. That's the way to build the party, and that's not easy. The Green Party has often never been able to get more than 400 members to run for local office, and there are 2.5 million local offices that people can run for. So, folks, if you believe in the Green Party agenda, and it's a very good agenda, start at the local level.
Well, thank you, Laura Palmer, for your question. I want to thank Terrence Flanagan for his question, and we'll keep working our way through your Facebook questions on future shows. Keep them coming. I think we've come to the end, Ralph. I want to also thank our guest today, Barry Ladendorf of Veterans for Peace, veteransforpeace.org, and John R. MacArthur, author of The Selling of Free Trade, NAFTA, Washington, and the Subversion of American Democracy. I'm Steve Scrovan, and I will be back again next week with another edition of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Have a good week, Ralph.
Yes, and thank you, Steve, and thank your good listeners. Remember, almost every major progressive movement in our country required less than 1% of the people rolling up their arms and engaging vigorously on redirections that are supported by a majority of the people.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
From Pacifica, you've been listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, www.nader.org.
Special thanks to John Richard, Matthew Marin.
Our graphic designer is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our editor is Jimmy Lee Wirt. Our board operator is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
Oh, what the hell. Let's make him our producer.
Our producer is Jimmy Lee Wirt.
And thanks to our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
And most importantly, special thanks to Mr. Ralph Nader, www.nader.org.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, is written and performed by Kemp Harris.
If you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour as a podcast and would like to listen to it as a broadcast,
call your local radio station and say, I want the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
He's Steve Scrovan.
I'm Steve Scrovan. He's David Feldman.
Until next time.
Thieves in the temple, too much money changing hands. It's really very simple. Just make a list of demands. We demand freedom. We demand equality. We demand justice. It ain't gonna happen until folks like you and me just stand up. Well, you've been sitting way too long.
Oh, step up.
You know what's right and you know what's wrong.
Rise up.
Don't let the system hold you down.
Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long.
Well. Say you're tired of trying. You say we have no choice. Say you're just one person, and who will hear your voice? Don't let them fool you. You have the power in your hand. I'm only trying to school you. Listen to me, people. Do you understand? We gotta
stand up.
Oh, you've been sitting way too long.
Oh, step up.
You know what's right and you know what's wrong.
Rise up.
Don't let the system hold you down.
Stand up.
Hey,
Stand up.
hey,
You've been sitting way too long.
Stand up. Oh, you should.
Oh, step up.
Step up. I think that you should step up.
Rise up.
Rise up and take on the power.
Stand up.
Hey,
Stand up.
hey.
You've been sitting way too long. Stand up.
Oh, stand up.
Oh, step up.
Step up. You ought to step up.
Rise up.
Rise up. I know you ought to rise up and
Stand up.
Hey,
Stand up.
hey,
You've been sitting way too long. Stand up.
I think you
Oh,
should
step up.
step up. I think that you should step up.
Rise up.
Don't let the system hold you down.
Stand up.
Hey,
Stand up.
hey,
You've been sitting way too long. Stand up.
Oh, stand up.
Step up.
Step up. I think you should step up.
Rise up.
And you rise up because you have the power.
Stand up.
Hey.
Stand up. You've been sitting way too long.
Stand up, stand up, you
Step up.
step up. I think that we all should
Rise up.
And you rise up, and you rise up,
Stand up.
and you
Stand
rise
up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up. Stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up. Rise up. Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up.
Step up, it's in your hand, hey.
Rise up.
And you rise up.
Stand up, stand up. You've been sitting way too long. Stand up. Oh, step up.